Great, thank you. Okay, let me just, sorry, just get this to begin with. I'll need this. Knew I was forgetting something. Slightly controversial topic. Does jumps racing have a future? It's obviously a very controversial topic, and I'd like to present to you some ideas today. Quickly looking at the different jumps racing in different parts of the world and models for jumps racing. To then talk a bit about a situation in, Yurtsi mentioned it before, the only state in Australia now that has jumps racing is Victoria. But in 2008, 2009, that was severely threatened. It was closed, but has come back. And to finish off with a little bit about where we are in Australia and some of the challenges for jumps racing in the world. So, very quickly, you've probably we've seen the first slide before. I've added to it here. Around the world, jumps racing looks very different, even within those regions. So within the Americas, the USA, jumps racing. But mostly it's in Europe and the Mediterranean area. But within that, it's very different between countries. Clearly, places such as Ireland, for example, has 1,424 jumps races, 16,467 starts. So that's the number of, not individual horses starting, it's total starts. So one horse might start 2 times, another horse might start 14 times for the season. But if you do the mathematics on it, you can work out the average is about 11 horses per race. On average, it could vary a lot in Ireland. Whereas a country like Germany, for example, we just heard about Czechia. Germany, the biggest economy in Europe, 15 jumps races, 99 starts. Not only are there few jumps races, there are few horses doing less than average of 7 per horses per race. If you look at in the Asian area, Japan, New Zealand, which is a much smaller country than Australia, has a population of 4 million compared to about 26 million. More starts, more jumps races. So it really does vary. So jumps racing itself includes hurdles, steeplechasing. Also, it was reminded this morning, point to point, obviously amateur jump racing and other things. So in Australia and New Zealand, the hurdles are brush fences and of the same height. And yes, there have been a lot of efforts to make them safe over time. The steeplechasing involves the higher fences and varying heights and formations. So it could be water jumps, ditches, etc. In America, the National Steeplechase Association, they have a distinction between national fences, which is brush, like hurdles, you can know, but also the timber, the fixed fences you can see on the right. I'll go back one slide. Actually, no, I won't. I don't know if I can. They have the timber fences, and the timber fences are no give. They just fall, so only the better quality horses go onto those fences, and they are more dangerous. Also, looking around the world, some places such as England, it's very strong, and a lot of Irish horses and other horses go over there. So we have a Cheltenham Festival over a number of days. You can see the grandstand there, the horses approaching the jump. But also here, Liverpool, Aintree, you can see the big fields adds to the danger. Unfortunately, that image, I should warn you, there's a couple of other slides coming up where the images are unpleasant but real, so they're there for a purpose. You can see the maintenance going over the jumps, how the horses really do change the brush, the fences, but unfortunately a horse did die in that race. Lots more horses. If a fall happens with more horses, there's more likely to be injuries or carnage with the bigger fields. So that's one of the ironies of trying to get more horses into the race. You increase the risk that something will go wrong. In America, it's different. So in America, generally, it's not on racetracks. So the flat racing on racetracks, a lot of dirt tracks, some grass tracks, but the jumps racing is held separately, and it's not about gambling. It's usually in horse parks or some other event, and it's away from the city, so it's not close to. It's very minor, and it doesn't have gambling involved in it. And you can see, make sure we push the right button this time. Some of the images, only 3 horses in that image there. The picnics, people having fun, family, and the car sale. So you pay for a spot. It's not free. You pay for a spot at the back, and you get your selection of where you want to go. But what is important in terms of the model is that whether you're a horse enthusiast, a family, fun day, friends, but it's a non-profit organisation raising funds for the Stroud Water Research Centre and the Penn Vet New Bolton Centre. So it's a charity. It's a purpose. It's not run on the same model as in places like England or Australia, which is about betting and same as flat horse racing. This is a very different model. It's a non-profit organisation model. Some other examples here, the Charlotte Steeplechase, again, make a tax-deductible donation for the foundation for the community who need it most. This one here, the Iroquois one in Tennessee, it's for the children's hospital. So by supporting jumps racing, you are supporting children's hospitals. This one here in Kentucky, the High Hope Steeplechase Association, University of Kentucky's Children's Cancer Research Foundation. So it's very much tied up with a cause other than horse racing, people having fun, or the things that don't work, watching thrills and spills. People don't want to watch the spills anymore. So in this sense, there's perhaps an added reason for it. Because it's also out in the country, it's in areas that's away from the main racetracks, it is not as, and it's smaller, it's only perhaps 1 or 2 meetings a year. It's not as controversial in America for animal welfare issues as it is compared to other cases that we heard earlier, just before lunch, the challenges in England with the protests at the various events there. So if we try to summarise some of those changes I've just been talking about, in the UK, New Zealand and Australia, it's on racetracks, the venue, whereas in America it tends to be in horse parks and estates that are separate away from the city. The rationale varies. Rather than profit, it's charity. Is there gambling? Well, yes, in the places like Australia and New Zealand, England, it's the same as a flat race. You gamble on your, no, you can bet. If you go to the USA, officially, there's no betting on these events. The prize money is high in Australia, New Zealand, etc., compared to America. Not necessarily very high compared to flat racing. There's more money in flat racing. In the USA, it's more about the tradition and the trophies. Very nice trophies, but very little money. So that means that there's not very many owners and trainers involved, a very small community. They help each other out. They're all sort of feeding each other, getting water for each other, etc., borrowing equipment sometimes. In the link to flat racing, which is important, in places like Australia and New Zealand, it may cause an image problem. And if you have flat racing being strong and jumps racing being weak, then potentially, and I'll talk about this afterwards, the focus for animal welfare protests on jumps racing can damage the reputation of flat racing, and that becomes an issue. In the USA, that's less likely to occur because they're not on the same racetrack, because the jumps races are way out in the country, often away, and because they're associated with a charity function. So when it all goes well, it goes some older images here. It goes well. I'd certainly respect takes a lot to train a horse to race 5 kilometres over varying fences. It doesn't happen overnight. There needs to be a long built-up relationship with the horse. There's excitement when it wins, the owners are happy, etc. When it goes badly, it goes badly, unfortunately, okay? And that's very real, but it's also, it looks bad. Not only is it bad scientifically, we've heard from the earlier speaker that scientifically you can say that jumps racing is more dangerous than flat racing, but the optics of it, the vision of it is also worse because it happens on the racetrack and people can see. So here, you can see this one was actually a horse that long distance race. It ruptures aorta in its chest. That's why it fell. It didn't fall because it necessarily misjumped or anything. You can see the crowd looking, the horrified faces there, and the green screen up to try and protect it. But it hasn't stopped everybody seeing that. And that is part of the image that the issue here. You can't stop people seeing it. Okay, so. Here at the track, people are watching. Unfortunately, that's what they're seeing. And it happens. It's, as we said, the risk is that's what happens. But it also happens wide. It happens on television. So I can say, looking at this image here, it's in England. It's from the race course called Newton Abbot. 4 minutes and 9 seconds approximately into the race with 2 jumps to go. You can see here a horse is just about to have a crash. It's on television, it's recorded, you can stop, play it, I can show it in a presentation. So it's not something that can be hidden in that sense. With the advent of technology, smartphones, anybody can be at that course and take pictures and put them on the internet. It's really easy. So the optics here make it really hard. Unless you can make jumps racing completely safe, then you can be pretty confident the images will be spread to other places. So what smartphones and that technology have done has enabled places that were previously invisible to become more visible, not just on the racetrack, so perhaps seeing this sort of thing and recording it, but also back behind the state. So this is where in Australia, 2019, animal welfare people broke into an abattoir, a slaughterhouse up in the Gold Coast north of Brisbane, just south of Brisbane. Actually, sorry, it's the Sunshine Coast, just north of Brisbane. And then filmed it at night. Horses were being sent there for slaughtered. Quietly, they were supposed to be in a paddock grazing. According to the official traceability records, they'd been sent to a paddock that was when they went off the track. All of a sudden, a truck pulls up in the night, they get taken off to another state, and then they get killed, and really badly treated before being killed as well. It ends up on national television. That's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the national broadcast equivalent to the BBC in the UK, doing a 1 hour special, which really did shock trainers and the racing community, who rightly said it shouldn't happen. So the idea of some areas being secret, being out of sight, just doesn't exist anymore, or won't exist for very long because of the technology that's existing. So if we think about now trying to position jumps racing relative to other sports and issues here, this is from a book chapter. I've got the reference at the end. It was 2015, I published it. So we're talking about what I call the risk, intentionality and response spectrum. So, and this is going to Yurtzi's talk at the very beginning, we don't do certain things anymore. We don't have gladiatorial contests like ancient Rome between gladiators where they kill each other, for example. We don't have bullfighting has been recently outlawed, cockfighting, roosters, dog fighting, fox hunting. They've all been banned. You can see what's happening here, especially when animals don't have a choice. Humans might, you say, you have a choice to get into a boxing ring or something else. Animals don't necessarily have that choice. Those are the sort of activities that historically have been banned. But it's actually coming back the other way, where there's a significant risk of unintentional harm. So not intended to, so these ones here, intentional harm. You actually intend to kill the dog or one of the dogs. Here it's unintentional, but it's a significant risk. If anybody's seen Calgary Stampede, chuck racing, whole lot of horses tied up, the wagon goes over, it can be terrible. Jumps racing is pretty much positioned in that sense, along with rodeo, other areas, as having more risk of harm. Small risk of unintentional harm, places like America, particularly with some of the drugs on the flat racing, and unlikely to cause harm. Yes, harm can be caused, but it's also where the harm is caused. It's not necessarily seen on the track. So flat racing, it could be in training, it could be afterwards, a horse might be lame back in the stables. The issue here, apart from the actual, there's more scientific risk of harm, is that it's seen on the track, as I showed the early images. It's hard to hide if a horse falls at a jump and everybody can see it. So what's happened here, it's a general approach to reform the industry through to bans. This one, I'll just point out, that include concern of what happens to horses when they leave the track. So the post-racing, and that becomes important as an argument for why do we have jumps racing. One of the arguments that used to prevail was because it was a life after horses that were not very fast on the racetrack on the flat, they could go into jump racing. That argument is getting weaker and weaker and hard to sustain. The reason being, people say, well, actually, you could have a lot of other post-care. We should be looking after horses, not sending them into jumps racing where they're at risk of unintentional harm. So that argument is definitely harder to sustain if people want to continue jumps racing. So I'm just going to take you through an example here now. In 2008, 2009, Yurtzi mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the conference today, there's only one state in Australia that still has jumps racing as of 2023, and that is the state of Victoria. In 2008, 2009, that state closed jumps racing, and it was really very much likely to be closed for a long time, and I'll explain that it came back and how it came back. But at that time, there were a number of issues about perceptions, and I just want to take you through a few quotes and explain why. So hopefully you can see the different perspectives that are at play here. A lot of the animal welfare people will say that the trainers, owners don't love their horses, because if you did, you wouldn't put them over something that's high risk. Yeah, I disagree with that argument, by the way. But there's a certain perception here that yes, the people who are training, and obviously a lot of people in this room, training jumps, races, etc., they do get attached because it takes longer to do that. It takes longer to train. It's not like getting a 2-year-old and, because it runs fast, get it onto the track and run it fast. It takes a very long time, a lot of skill to train a horse to run 5 kilometres over varying heights and jumps. But the last part here, it's sad it died. It was really attached to the horse, but that's jumping. There's a sort of an acceptance that death is part of jumping, and that's what a lot of the animal welfare people don't accept. They don't accept that premise that a horse has to die for entertainment, for tradition, for whatever other reason. So I would certainly agree that people who train, own, ride, jumpers, etc., love the horses, but there's a different perception operating about the animal and about death. Here's another example. This is from a trainer up in Newcastle, which is an area just north of Sydney where jumps racing doesn't exist. They had a horse that wasn't very fast on the track, wasn't very successful. Take it down to Victoria where jumps racing was existing, and it won some races, okay? They said, well, what's good about it? Most of the horses will find their way to the knackery. So basically, there's a question here not about jumps racing, but what is the care for horses off the track? Do we just see them as a commodity to be used, and if they're not fast enough, we'll send them to the knackery, the slaughterhouse, and get new horses? That is a question being raised here. This horse called Conzeal has a nice life now as a show horse. Would he have had that without going to Victoria for a jumps career? So that raises questions about the positionality, I guess, of jumps racing and the overall care for horses as they're educated to enter the racing industry, through their racing industry in terms of their temperament, health, etc., and then beyond the racing industry. This is a newspaper called the Warrnambool Standard. In Australia, most of the jumps racing is in Victoria, and particularly in the area west of Melbourne called Warrnambool. It's an old, richer grazing area, so that's where the biggest races, the most expensive races are. The quote here, if the horse, Juno Lad, wasn't a jumper, where would he be? Probably going around Sandown, which Sandown Park is a horse racing course, but there's a greyhound race course next door. Inside a greyhound would be his next start. In other words, he'd be pet food or dog food for the greyhound. Okay, you can see some of the issues here. So the idea saying is that jumps racing has extended the life of a horse that would otherwise become dog meat. I want to take you through now some of the controversy around this time, 2008, 2009. It certainly was controversial. This is a newspaper in Victoria called the Stock and Land. It's a conservative newspaper. It's a rural agricultural newspaper, that's its audience. It basically blamed the loony left for having jumps racing banned. Personally, I think that's not helpful to sort of characterisation here. You can see from their own page that their number of falls to starters was double. It was rising. The fatalities was also going up. There was a real problem here, okay? A problem not just in general, but a problem within the last few years. And when I did interviews and talked with some trainers in Victoria and South Australia, some of them quietly said, actually the animal welfare people did the best thing possible here because there was a problem. We were training horses not as well. We weren't spending the time. We were just getting them out racing, and they weren't educated properly. And some of the jumps that they tried to make safer, particularly the hurdles, they made it so that the horses weren't actually jumping anymore. The horses were running through the hurdles at speed, and that was what was causing some of the problems. They weren't actually jumping at all. So you can see here in terms of the fatalities, and there was a genuine problem despite the way it was characterised in a paper. It was banned, but then it came back. Why did it come back? because there was one man, essentially, a man called Dennis Natfine, who's a veterinarian. He was a local member for Warrnambool. Warrnambool is a very strong racing area, so it's called, the seat electorate was called Portland, then it changed its name to the southwest coast. It's the southwest of Melbourne. He became the Minister for Racing, and then he became the Premier of Victoria. And by people who really wanted the jumps racing industry, he was seen as a saviour. So St. Dennis was sort of the name that was given. That the political influence and power of one man within a particular party pretty much prevented jumps racing from ending in Victoria. It brought it back. He put more money into it. They did make the jumps, try to make the jumps safer. They did all the things that they wanted to do. They restricted fields to certain sizes in cases. They had more education for horses. They did various things. Horses were pulled up if they were uncompetitive. I didn't see that happening yesterday, but horses were pulled up because they realised that at the last jumps or later in the race after, say, 3,200 metres or 4,000 metres, a tired horse was more likely to get injured if they fell at the last jump, and if they were uncompetitive, there's no point putting them over that last jump. So that was a change. So that's now allowed in Australia, and you can see if you look at finishing for a race, perhaps the last 2 or 3 horses they're not going to get any prize money. They're not going to be in the first 3 for betting money, anything. They can be pulled up safely to protect safety. That's certainly a change. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the research methods, just to show you that it's there. I just want to quickly show you Australia, and this, you see in the Australian states there. So the state I was talking about before, Victoria, and the area southwest of Melbourne is Warrnambool, is the main jumps racing area. I'll come back to this afterwards to talk about other Australian states, but in 2008, 2009, it was definitely under threat. And we looked at a study in after 2012. So we did a study in 2012 of the 2008, 2009, and then later did another study. And we were looking at media frames. If you want a fundamental critique of the jumps racing industry, don't go to the Warrnambool Standard. It's a very supportive newspaper of jumps racing. So it was interesting, what were they saying, and did it change over time? And the answer is yes, it did. You can see in 2008, 2009, it was battling for survival. These were the number of frames, the way in which the story was being constructed. These percentages will not add up to 100 because one story can have more than one frame. So you might, for example, have a newspaper article that says jumps racing's under threat, battling for survival. That's a real shame because it's culturally important, economically important. Okay, so it's possible to have multiple frames in a single story, so the numbers won't add up to 100%. But there's a big change between 2008, 9 and 2012 and 13 in Victoria through this one newspaper, the Warrnambool Standard. It was actually far less about battling for survival. Culturally important was raised a lot more in 2020, but not compared to what it was previously. Economic importance wasn't stressed because it wasn't that economically important. It was to people involved. It was in terms of the other parts of the industry, but not compared with other industries and not compared with flat racing. So that it was not a good frame to use. It wasn't working. Things that were working, a lot more stories about the individual horse, stories about personalising the jockeys, the trainers, the jumpers, industry being resurgent. So it was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, writing stories about the industry being vibrant, sort of probably contributed to the industry being vibrant, but safety was another one, the managing for safety. So clearly the way in which the stories were being constructed changed over time. So to finish towards the end, where's jumps racing at today in 2023 in Australia? Well, it's been gone for many decades in states such as Queensland, around Brisbane, and Perth, Western Australia. I'm talking about the 1920s or so now. The reasons it went there is that, corruption. This is before you have television, etc. Jockeys were falling off their horses accidentally at jumps because it's easier to do that in a jumps race than a flat race. And it was just corruption. So people weren't betting on it because they didn't trust. So there was a lack of integrity. It was an integrity issue. But also, the fewer horses racing, not enough jockeys. And it's a common problem in areas. We've heard a little bit about it with industries where the horse racing industry is marginal. But the tracks were too dry. Okay, those states are dry. The tracks are dry in those areas. So if we jump forward to 1997, around New South Wales, Sydney, jumps racing was ended, but it was also banned. It was made illegal. You cannot legally hold a jumps racing event in New South Wales since 1997. As I've said, talked about, it almost ended in Victoria in 2008, 2009. It still exists. Tasmania, I forgot. Tasmania's a small state here. It ended, but wasn't banned. It ended because of this same reason. Few horses racing, not enough jockeys, and they were coming down from Melbourne or across from New Zealand. It really wasn't worth it, but it wasn't banned. In South Australia, the writing was on the wall for a few years here. It ended in 2021, and it was banned, made illegal in 2022. In comparison, in Victoria, the one that was almost ended in 2008, 2009, it's, I'd say, thriving compared to where it was in 2008, 2009. There were more horses competing, more prize money, still small compared with flat racing, still mostly focused on the Warrnambool area, but it does continue to exist. So hopefully, a conclusion, for jumps racing advocates, there are different models to consider, the American model, the charity, etc. But what will happen is that animal welfare issues are pronounced in jumps racing because death, injury and perceived cruelty, the risk is higher. We heard from the British Horse Racing Association. They said, he admitted the risk is high, it is, but it's also very visible. It's seen, it happens on the racetrack, it's not behind the scenes, and that's also the irony is perhaps if you attract more children, like we had 17,500 people here yesterday, lots of kids, great time. If you get a really bad day, fortunately it didn't happen yesterday, if you get a really bad day, what are those children seeing? Okay, it's going to be awful. Where jumps racing is fighting for survival in different countries or different states, adopting some of the aspects of the US model may be sort of an inoculation against criticism potentially, because it's not just about a small group of people wanting to race horses for tradition or jump horses for tradition. It's actually going to other causes like children's cancer or hospitals, etc. If that's the case, you still need to address animal welfare issues, and I know that is happening. Change the jumps to be made safer, but not such that you can just run through them and, at high speed. That's not safe. Ensure jockeys and horses are properly trained. You could see yesterday, to get around those courses, those horses and jockeys had to be properly trained. I think one jockey fell off, but that was small. But previously, where the jockeys and the horses weren't properly trained, there were more accidents occurring in places such as Australia. The arguments about a second chance post-racing career, they're not going to work anymore. They might have worked in the past. They won't work in the future because the alternative is off-the-track racing programs, other ways of looking after horses that don't involve them putting at risk over jumps racing. In areas where jumps racing is culturally strong, it will continue for some time. But as we heard this morning, at places like Aintree and Cheltenham, it will face increased animal welfare protests. So jumps racing needs to be able to demonstrate safety, but that is actually going to be harder in an era of anthropogenic climate change, because the idea of having long races on hot days, on harder tracks, that's an animal welfare concern. So you have to water the tracks, you have to somehow cool the animals, maybe run at a different time of day, but that is another welfare concern to take into account. Where there's few horses, not many jockeys, low prize money, the issue is what happened in South Australia. The risk of jumps racing to the reputation of flat racing became too great. I mean, I could see a few years earlier, just talking with people, that they were thinking about closing jumps racing because they were thinking it's damaging the reputation of flat racing industry in South Australia, and that's the way it eventually went. So the actual racing industry in South Australia closed jumps racing. It wasn't closed by the government. The jumps racing industry closed itself, said we're not scheduling any meetings for next year, and then afterwards the government banned it in Parliament the following year. The government had nothing to do with closing the racing industry in South Australia. It was because there weren't many jockeys, the prize money was low, and so on. If you get a situation where welfare concerns are strong, we've seen in the Australian states, 1997 in New South Wales, 2022 in South Australia, it may be banned. So it's not banned in some places. It's probably unlikely to come back because there's few horses, few jockeys, but it can actually be made illegal in some states. So again, there's no set future where it go. It will be different in different places. There are some models that perhaps might provide inoculation against criticism, as I've already pointed out, in different places. But those criticisms you can see around the world. I think that there's more protest, more controversy, and this is one of the most controversial aspects of horse racing. And I'll leave you on that point. Thank you very much.
Proszę Państwa, Phil jest do Państwa dyspozycji. Są pytania? Proszę bardzo.
Mam pytanie do tego momentu w Wiktorii w tym roku 2008-2009. Okej. Mogę mówić po angielsku, ale tak angielsku? Okay, I will ask in English.
I can turn it on now.
Okay, so I will tell in Polish because more people will understand. Chciałem się spytać o ten moment w stanie Wiktoria w roku 2008-2009, bo pokazywał Pan ten slajd, że rosła liczba upadków i śmierci, tak, w wyścigach. I jaka była diagnoza? Co było przyczyną? Bo potem mówił Pan o środkach zaradczych, a jaka była przyczyna, że było, mimo, tak jak zrozumiałem, tej samej liczby wyścigów i startów, rosły upadki i śmierć koni? Dziękuję.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your question. Sorry, just listening to the end of the question, there's a slight delay, which is why I didn't answer straight away. No, it's a really good question, and they did investigate that. There were a number of reasons. The two that stood out was that the tracks were hard. It was dry time period, so the hard tracks, and that was likely to have caused some injuries. The other one was the lack of training and education. They were rushing horses off the flat into the jumps racing without having the necessary education, training to be able to do it. And I guess the third one was the safety issues around some of the jumps that I talked about. Some of the horses weren't actually jumping, they were running at speed through hurdles, and there was crashes there. So a combination of reasons meant that there were more accidents and more, unfortunately, more fatalities per race, per start. So do you want to say to other people in Polish? Yeah, so, yeah, okay. So.
Dopytałem się, czy to było połączone według nich z mniejszym profesjonalizmem osób zaangażowanych w wyścigi skakane i czy to było przyczyna była w presji finansowej?
Yeah, okay. The rules of racing didn't change. From what I understand, perhaps horses were being rushed into the jumps industry without the necessary training and, as I was saying, jumping over, particularly the hurdles, without actually jumping. So, and that is to do with financial pressure. In Australia is set up as a horse breeding area, mostly for flat racing, for sprint flat racing, and particularly for 2-year-old racing. It's a big prize money for effectively like kindergarten kids running Olympic Games for medals for big prize money, and then they become stallions and go into breeding at age 3 or 4 before any injuries turn up. And it's all about churning over the breeding industry and making money, and for owners getting a quick return because you don't have to look after a horse for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. For racing, you can get your money back from a 2-year-old, from a 3-year-old, and that is a financial pressure that probably did have an impact. There's probably not as much money going into the jumps racing to educate, to look after it. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one down the.
Moje pytanie jest następujące. W 2022 roku zamknięte zostały wyścigi przeszkodowe w Australii Południowej. Natomiast od razu stan Victoria zgłosił się po te wyścigi. Nie dość, że je przejął, te 10 wyścigów, które były zagrożone i tam pani wicepremier Australii mówiła, że ze względu na nieopłacalność ekonomiczną i tak dalej te wyścigi będą zakazane. To nie dość, że Racing Victoria przejęła te wyścigi, żeby wypełnić lukę, to jeszcze na dokładkę podniosła o $850 000 pulę nagród przewidzianą w tych wyścigach. Czy to nie jest jednak tak, że tutaj decyduje o tym wszystkim lobby? Nie znam struktury politycznej w Australii, jak to wygląda w poszczególnych stanach, czy to ma jakiś wpływ między sobą, ale skoro Racing Victoria jest w stanie przejąć te wyścigi, podnieść pulę nagród i to wszystko się kręci, Australia Południowa zamyka to, w tym kończy historię chyba jednego z największych wyścigów przeszkodowych Great Eastern w Oakbank, to chyba coś tutaj no nie jest tak. Dobrostan dobrostanem, ale jednak chyba polityczne układy, lobby i tak dalej ma znaczenie.
Yep, still going, just finish the question. Thank you. Yes, I mean, the political influences on politics, they're important. So we have the states, 2 states, one South Australia, which is Adelaide, and as you mentioned, Oakbank is a track just in the Adelaide Hills outside Adelaide. Victoria is Melbourne, Warrnambool, Ballarat, Bendigo, those sort of places. The horse race, the jumps racing, sorry, was pretty much confined to Victoria. 2008-9 onwards, more money went into it. More people live in Melbourne, bigger population in Victoria than South Australia, and also more regional centres of size. The industry in South Australia was actually already through the 2010, 2015, 2020, largely being supported by Victorian horses and jockeys coming over. There was not a strong base in South Australia. That's why the Jockey Club in South Australia closed the industry, and Oakbank was controversial. They wanted to continue, but Morpheville, the main track in Adelaide, they closed. So they did run some high weight flat races. But yeah, Victoria could see the opportunity to have perhaps a bit more racing, jumps racing. So geographically, it's been confined for an owner. Having a trainer, more jumps racing in Victoria potentially is a good thing for them. The horses don't have to travel to South Australia. They can compete more in Victoria. But it shows in Australia and places like America the importance of the state, not the national level, in terms of decision making. Does that answer the question?